Is debating the possibility of action in Syria. What's the latest coming out of that discussion?
Well, it's quite a fiery discussion now. It's Secretary of State John Kerry, Secretary of Defence Chuck Hagel, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, who were all up before the House of Representatives today, which is where I am. And some of the questions they're getting are, why didn't you act sooner? What about the humanitarian efforts and crisis that refugees? And what about the longer-term game here? And these are the kind of questions they were getting yesterday, but perhaps a bit more of an abrasive line of questioning today in the House of Representatives. You've had some congressmen say, is this all just a cover-up from the administration's other issues that are pending, such as the economic crisis, the debt ceiling, and other issues that the president has to deal with? So it's a lot feistier in the House of Representatives, and that just reflects a much more divided opinion here in the House. You speak to congressmen here and they will tell you that many have not yet made up their mind on whether to support military action. Yesterday, the Republican Speaker of the House, John Boehner, said that he would support military action in Syria after he met with President Obama at the White House, and he urged others to do so. So the signs would suggest that perhaps the House of Representatives, which is where I am now, may well go for military action in Syria. But it's very difficult to guess and work out which way it will go. Of course, there's also the Senate, which has been debating this too.
Meanwhile, President Obama has, of course, left them with the thought, as he travels to St. Petersburg for the G20, that America's credibility is at stake in all of this. And, you know, often in these diplomatic discussions, face-to-face talks can make a difference, but it's difficult to imagine that when President Obama talks to President Putin, that he will have anything up his sleeve that can alter the dynamic between America and Russia on Syria.
Yes, and that's going to be an interesting one to watch when the two meet in the coming days. Of course, the reason why tensions are frosty between the pair is really not necessarily to do with the situation in Syria, although for a long time they've held opposing views. But one of the catalysts for the reason why President Obama called off a planned one-to-one meeting with President Putin in this trip is, of course, the issue of Edward Snowden and Russia's decision to give temporary asylum to him. So that's in the back of President Obama's mind too, but I mean, it will be interesting to watch how they all interact this week. I mean, the issue really, though, rests with Congress. President Obama said last weekend he wanted congressional approval before taking any military action in Syria. And what's really interesting here today, actually, Anita, is what's going on next door in the Senate. Now, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee drew up a draft proposal of what it would put potentially as a bill before the Senate next week for senators to vote on, and in that it said it would limit any action to 60 days and would prohibit any boots on the ground. But it's interesting because you've got leading Republican senators such as Senator John McCain who've come out today and say they don't quite support that resolution. So what's happening right now in that committee room next door in the Senate is that they're thrashing something out so they can all come together and agree on a resolution which they can vote on and agree on and then pass over for voting next week. And Senator McCain is of the view that actually more needs to be done, which is interesting because you've got such a range of opinions, Anita. You've got people who don't want to go anywhere near any kind of military action. We've been hearing a lot of that here in the House today. Then you've got people who are saying there needs to be a longer term plan. Senator McCain saying there needs to be much more military support given to the Syrian opposition. And then you've got the administration saying, well, this is going to be limited and proportional. And it's where these all meet is how we might see some agreement in the coming days.
OK, Rajini, thank you very much for that. Rajini Vaidyanathan in Washington. Well, Syria, of course, expected to dominate tomorrow's meeting of the world's leaders at the G20 summit in St. Petersburg. Our diplomatic correspondent, BRIDGET KENDALL, is there. And earlier she said it seemed highly unlikely that the Russians and Americans would succeed in finding common ground on how best to deal with the Syrian crisis.
We're already, before the summit starting, we're seeing the two protagonists, if you like, the Russian president and the American president, one in Moscow, the other in Sweden, laying out in detail their positions on this Syria subject. We can be sure that that's going to come up again in front of the G20 leaders. But whether there'll be any more any movement towards a meeting of minds, that seems highly unlikely. President Obama made pretty clear his mind is made up about what he wants to do. There's some hint of room for Russia to shift its position, but only if the UN weapons inspectors, I think, come up with evidence which points towards the Assad regime. And in the meantime, the other thing that can happen at this G20 summit, which is maybe not irrelevant, is to see how these other countries line up. Which countries are sympathetic to the United States, which ones support the Russian and the Chinese position of blocking at the UN Security Council. One very important thing that President Obama said from Sweden today was, we may be moving into a world where it's more dangerous not to do something than to do it. And if you don't respond to chemical weapons, this might make it more dangerous, more likely it will happen again. And if the UN Security Council is blocked, maybe we need to be prepared to move outside it. That'll be an argument he makes here at G20. Who will be listening? Who will agree with him?
BRIDGET KENDALL. Let's focus now on opinion among Syria's neighbours, who are of course bearing the brunt of the refugee flow already. Our chief international correspondent, Sept, has been speaking to the Jordanian Prime Minister in an exclusive interview. She asked what if any action should be taken in Syria.
It has to be limited to the to limit, or as a matter of fact to exterminate whatever possibility of the existence of chemical arms in Syria. That will be.
So you would publicly support a military strike if it was proven?
That will be to the benefit of Syria and the Syrian people.
Would you need UN authorization as well? The UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has said that a strike would not be legal unless it was proven and had UN authorization, and whether it was in self-defense.
If there is a stalemate in the Security Council, then the world cannot be run like that. If there is a proof that is very clear, how can the United Nations Security Council hinder any measures? That will be very, very difficult to justify.
Many Jordanians tell me, many Jordanian politicians tell you that they're worried about the consequences of a military action in neighboring Syria. What are your fears right now?
Fears of everybody. Everybody on this globe does not want to see blood. So if it would be a very exact hit to the chemical weapons and does not hurt the civilians, or does not lead to any consequences that will hurt the civilians in Syria, that is a necessity. If the strikes are not surgical and not exact and not very well measured and very well contained, then it will be very, very, very dangerous and very risky.
Abdullah Ansor, the Jordanian Prime Minister, there in that exclusive interview with Sept. The headlines for you now on BBC News at almost 8:20. President Obama has said it's not his credibility on the line over the use of chemical weapons in Syria, but the international community's. Speaking in Sweden, Mr. Obama said he hadn't set a red line, the world had, by banning the use of such weapons.